This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor Charles Kesler his new book, I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism. Professor Kesler is the Dingler Dykema Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College, and he is the editor of the Claremont Review of Books and the Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. Professor Kesler, welcome.
Thanks, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Let me ask you, the subtitle of your book is Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism. What is the crisis of liberalism, and what are the sources and the roots of this crisis that you're describing?
Well, I guess first of all, I should say I'm talking about contemporary American liberalism, not classical liberalism or other parts of the liberal tradition. But the crisis of contemporary American liberalism is twofold, I think. One is fiscal, and the other is philosophical. The fiscal crisis is, I think, increasingly well known to Americans, and it consists in the fact that the kind of rights that have come to be the centerpiece of modern liberalism, socioeconomic rights to things like a job and health care and retirement, old age benefits, that kind of thing, cost much more than liberalism ever let on. And fiscally, we face a situation in which right now, because of the debt and the deficit crisis, the bond market is looking very uneasily at American public finances. But when you add to that the looming crisis of the entitlement state, which has really not yet hit, you can see that liberalism can't meet payroll. I mean, it just can't pay for all the promises that it has made, and it has no way of walking those promises back without repudiating them or seeming to repudiate them. And then the second crisis is a philosophical one, and that is that I think increasingly liberals really don't believe in liberalism anymore, or perhaps more precisely, they don't know why they believe in liberalism anymore. And you can see the problem most clearly in sort of avant-garde liberal thought, which has a postmodernist color to it. And the creed of postmodernism is that there are no truths out there, no moral and political truths, and really other kinds of truths too, by which we can steer our lives. And so if there's no truth, then liberalism is not true either. And how to be a liberal when you know there's no ground for liberalism is the deepest problem or sickness, I think, at the heart of modern liberalism.
It's interesting you mentioned and I think William Vogeley is where I associate that phrase from his book on the welfare state from 2010, that progressivism can't make payroll. I like that phrase. Also, it seems there is a unwillingness to actually make a public argument for the cost of the welfare state, for actually funding it. There is, of course, we see this right now. There's the notion that we can actually tax people in the 1% and pay for these things, but there's no notion of actually paying for our gigantic transfer state. We all want, there seems to be a majority or close to a majority wants it, but doesn't actually want to acknowledge how we get there.
No, and in this sense, President Obama is a perfect example of the problem. He, right now, our politics is locked in a debate on this question of whether or not to raise the top marginal tax rate of the wealthiest 2% or so from 36 to 39-something percent. And that debate, while revealing in its own way, is, of course, a massive evasion of the dimensions of the problem. I mean, if you really wanted to try to pay for the contemporary welfare state and its promises, you would be talking about a very large tax increases on everybody, and particularly on the middle class, since that's where the money is. But no Democrat, no liberal could say that and be elected. And so far at least, they simply don't say it. They don't confront the problem.
You mentioned the philosophical crisis, the philosophical problem with liberalism, and indeed, major liberal theorists argue precisely that to be liberalism is to be without a foundation, to be without certainties. That those who have those are the dangerous ones who would threaten the project, and this seems to be quite clear amongst a lot of European liberal writers, some in America. I wanted to ask you, however, this is not actually, and you talk about this in your book, this isn't something relatively new that breaks upon us. It seems to be a further distillation or kind of a dialectical working out of ideas that come from early progressive theorists and their writings. Talk about something, these movements in the book you describe, these three periods of progressivism, and maybe we're in a fourth, which in a way is both a recapitulation but a departure from those earlier periods.
Yes, the way I talk about it is to call these the three waves of liberalism. And they correspond basically to the New Freedom, Woodrow Wilson's slogan and his administration, the New Deal in the 30s, and of course the Great Society, and to some extent the New Left protest against the Great Society in the 60s. And then the question is the Obama phenomenon a fourth wave of liberalism that is going to issue in a permanent expansion or seemingly permanent expansion of the welfare state and a more ambitious and aggressive form of policy making. And judging from the first 2 years of the Obama administration, it looks like it is in fact a kind of fourth installment of the liberal advance. But the last 2 years, especially after the electoral repudiation of 2010, tell a very different story. And I think obviously a lot will depend upon what happens in the 2012 elections. But if I could just characterize the three waves very briefly. The first is what I call political liberalism, and the second economic liberalism, and the third cultural liberalism. And these are not precise historical labels, because there's a little of each kind of liberalism in every one of the waves. But I think it helps to sort of categorize our thinking about them. The Wilsonian wave looked at the Constitution, you could say, and the form of government and the practices of government coming out of it as the problem. Because the Constitution was an 18th century document shaped by 18th century thought, and it had to be fundamentally brought up to date, which means fundamentally, in a way, replaced, or at least the spirit of it had to be switched out for a new Darwinian progressivist spirit, which Wilson was the first, I think, to call the living Constitution. And then the second wave, the New Deal, is where, first of all, progressivism, as it were, changes its name to liberalism. FDR is really the sponsor of this new name, and he devoted a lot of speeches and time to thinking about the change and pressing the change. But of course, most important from the policy point of view, out of the New Deal come entitlement rights and socioeconomic rights and programs of the sort that we know as beginning with Social Security and flowering further in the 60s and the 70s. And then in the third wave, you really get not only a continuation of the New Deal's quantitative liberalism, dealing with socioeconomic status and problems, you also get a new life for qualitative liberalism, where the fundamentally disappointing nature of the American people, from liberalism's point of view, becomes the target. And what they want to do is sort of raise Americans' sights to fulfill all of their spiritual needs and in a well-rounded way, and liberate them from bourgeois morality and from the capitalist worldview, you could say.
And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, as I read your book, it seems there's this crucial linchpin in this phrase of progressivism you just described in terms of the spiritual values. Of course, there's a spiritualism even in the early progressivism.
Yes, that's right.
Woodrow Wilson. But with, and we can say Lyndon Baines Johnson's administration and the Great Society, you spent a lot of time analyzing those speeches, those behind the movement. And it's almost as if there is this new emphasis on living with meaning, living with authenticity and purpose. Of course, most middle-class Americans would say, yes, that's what I'm doing every day with work, with family, with my own religion, etc. But it seems to me that there's something you're trying to point to there between that and a later wave of progressivism, or a more shall we say, that almost kind of moves against America in large respect with the New Left, and that both are kind of rejecting a notion, or so bourgeois values, as you put it, and wanting government to, in effect, make people better, raise us higher. So a telecratic view of government. Am I wrong in that, or something much more powerful happening with the New Left?
No, that is true, I think. There had always been, both in Wilson and in Dewey and in almost every major figure of American liberalism beforehand, there had always been an impulse to regard American culture as a kind of spin-off of the worldview embodied in the Constitution, which regarded human nature as fixed, which regarded nature and not history or progress as the fundamental category, and who, in the progressives' view, this view accepted a much too egoistic and selfish version of a fixed human nature. And so the moral sights of America were always very low in their estimation. And so they all wanted, in one way or another, to remake America's soul, to, as Michelle Obama would say, to fix the hole in our souls. And in a strange way, both LBJ and LBJ's fiercest critics on the new left in the 60s, both agreed with that diagnosis, but they came to slightly different conclusions about how to do it. It leaves aside the question, of course, whether they were correct about the American soul. And one of the questions I don't exactly solve in the book, but I wanted to raise in the book is doubt about that, about their confidence that the American soul was always so disappointingly ignoble.
Disappointingly ignoble. It's interesting as well. I was reading your book. I was thinking of the spiritualism of progressivism. Of course, in particular, early 20th century, late 19th century, there's also a liberal Christianity, a liberal theology involved in the progressivism, but it's a very different kind of theology. I think it's fair to say it's one where science, the purported belief in scientific politics, economics is really setting the agenda for the world, and the church, as it were, comes in and adjusts and helps accomplish that work. And so in that sense, there's even a corruption or the seeds of corruption, I'll say, for this sort of expansive worldview of perfection that government can achieve, and even that government can direct civil society to achieve, that the space is also being evaporated between the citizen and the government. I want to back up, though. You mentioned LBJ and the Great Society, and not being too far apart from the New Left in terms of what they actually thought could be achieved. But yet there's a break, and the break seems to happen both around a philosophical belief that we've kind of discussed already, but also something much more radical, and that they see that there's not just flaws in America, but just a fundamentally corrupt country. It's a racist country, a hierarchical country, a sexist country. And this sort of sparks a turn against government, and yet at the same time there's never a thorough rejection of government, which would seem to be implied by that. There's kind of something like, I personally am authentic, even though society at large is not.
Yes, it produces this paradoxical situation where coming out of the 60s you have two seemingly contrary or contradictory impulses. On the one hand, that government can solve social problems, and so government is allowed to get bigger and bigger in order to have more and more programs to deal with more and more social ills. But at the same time, tremendously spreading and deepening distrust of everything government does. And I think both are authentic 60s impulses, and both are still very much with us. What's interesting is the peculiar character of the 60s suspicion of government. It's not. It wasn't the same as the older American suspicion of government. The older American suspicion was based on the assumption that human nature is flawed, that it isn't perfect, that it's not perfectly rational, that our passions are continually at war with reason, or that man is a fallen being, to put it in Christian or biblical terms. And so you could not expect perfection from such a fallen being. And that was a kind of moderating influence on American politics for a long time. But liberalism was always discontented with that view, and partly this is its roots in the German Enlightenment and in especially German idealism. And so there is some truth, to the old cliche about liberalism that it involves bringing heaven down to earth, or making of earth a kind of heaven. In Hegel, one could sort of see that is in a certain way the agenda, and much of the social gospel that you were alluding to just a moment ago was powered by that Hegelian sense that now that we understand ourselves completely, now that we've come to full self-consciousness, as Hegel would say, and realize what kind of beings we are, free beings possessed of infinite dignity, then there's no reason why we can't make a future for ourselves that is much more heavenly than anything here on earth, than anything that anyone previously had thought possible. And so the disillusionment that the New Left felt in the 60s was not that old-fashioned suspicion of the fallen man and his limits. It was something quite different. It was the belief that they were authentic. They, dwelled at a higher, purer moral level than their fellow Americans. The problem was their fellow Americans. They could not make a heaven on earth of a people like this. And so it was an epic turn, I think, in American liberalism when it became an anti-majoritarian phenomenon in the 60s. And instead of the old liberal argument of FDR, let's say, that the people are good, it's the Republican leaders, or it's the wealthiest of the wealthy capitalists that are oppressing everybody, and government needs to redress that. The new liberalism, the radicalism of the 60s, issued in the judgment that the people, the majority, are now and have always been racist, sexist, homophobic, property-loving, pro-slavery, all the worst kinds of original sins that social sins that could never be overcome. And so when they turned their back on the American majority, that majority increasingly turned its back on liberalism.
It's interesting to think, in describing the New Left, because something that I think is a paradox is it's actually there also, all right, this is the time of the rise of the sexual revolution, so you have, say, a radical individualism arising, which in the long run I think we can say has doomed the welfare state project, or the notion of a much larger entitlement state, from really happening, because it depends upon an increasing population. It actually depends upon families, it would seem, paying taxes, and this seems to be dissipated by certain forces at work, certain forces that are unleashed, I think, within that worldview, that radical belief in the self, which, it's interesting. As I was reading that part of your book recently, I've been reading Irving Kristol's kind of late 1970s essays on American institutions, and one of which he makes a point that I think really accentuates what you're saying. The radical belief in the self can't help but be a self-obsession and a self-centeredness that makes it impossible to really to have self-government. to have any sort of a shared communal civic participation, precisely because of the reasons you've outlined in your book.
Yes, and it's. I think you're absolutely right, and Irving Kristol's essays in the 70s are penetrating studies of the problem. It's basically the welfare state depends upon many things that are uncool from the point of view of the avant-garde left. It depends upon families, exactly as you say. It depends upon hard work, and it depends upon a certain kind of responsibility, which can be made to seem inauthentic and confining and bourgeois very easily by leftist academics and others. And so, since the logic of the advanced welfare state argument is that any need if felt by a large enough group of people, can become a right which government has to address by directing a stream of benefits to it in one way or another, and everyone else has a duty to pay for those benefits. You can see how the welfare state, as the culture radicalized, became or was put on a self-destructive course.
I want to and try and link this together, because I think this is really where we start to see the mind form of today's leaders, of today's progressive leaders, and in particular the one that looms large in your book, our president, Barack Obama. And you have a great analysis of his speeches and also of his books, kind of detailing his mind and detailing, I think, the postmodern aspects of his thought, and yet also great certainty in his thought, or will in his thought, in terms of something that must be achieved by America, even though I can't really give you precise reasons why. We could say that maybe the overarching reason why is egalitarianism. I wanted to read, you quote James Kloppenberg, an intellectual historian at Harvard who has done a lot of analysis of President Obama's thought, and he puts it around four terms: anti-foundationalism, particularism, perspectivalism, and historicism. Seems what joins all of those terms, though, is really a relativism. I mean, we can go into the different aspects of that philosophy that they engage, but there is, that seems to form the essence of his thought. I want to ask you a question, though. Where does his certainty come from, though, that we constantly see articulated in the speeches and in the policies?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about Obama is his confusion, or his confused mixing of strands of left or thought, or liberal thought, that don't keep house well together. On the one hand, he was tremendously moved by the example of the civil rights revolution in the United States in the 60s and the 50s. He was not, of course, a part of that. He was born in 1961. But as part of his own sort of search for his identity, which is the theme of his first book, the sort of autobiographical Dreams from My Father, he his early life was kind of a journey to learn what it was to be black and in America, and he chose that journey. I mean, he defined more or less what he wanted to be and how to become that. But in that journey, the nobility of the civil rights movement, I think, was an important thing for him. And in order for it to be noble, you had to be confident that somehow that it was right. I mean, that Jim Crow was not a morally ambiguous or complicated question. Jim Crow was wrong because it violated the equality that black American citizens should be able to expect from the law. But when you combine that kind of moral certainty with the relativism that was, I think, very prominent to some degree in his college education and just in the culture sort of the times, you come out with a very unstable result. How can there be, how can all values be relative and the civil rights movement be absolutely correct and opposition to it absolutely wrong and unjust? And to an extent, he tried to solve that problem in part by not thinking about it too clearly, but also by, when he did think about it, by deciding that that values are products of will, and so if you can will absolutely enough and grandly enough, you can remake society. You can make it over again. And he could never solve the problem of connecting will to right or will to justice. But he tends often to regard will as a kind of substitute for justice, or the closest we can get to justice. And so he has, as he explains in The Audacity of Hope, a great admiration for John Brown and for William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, people who, in his view, were prepared to act on their arbitrary and relativistic view of the good and the right, and impose it on America and remake America in the image of their own values, as it were. And that is the passages I quote from The Audacity of Hope are very revealing, I think, of a fellow who is struggling with issues like that and really can't come to any stable and admirable solution to them.
And I thought you quite nicely noted the fidelity to the civil rights movement, but yet also his own mind. He would not be able to make sense of either the reason and the grounding of reason that Martin Luther King makes his claims, and most famously, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. He would not be able to do that. King never really rests in reason or in will, but actually in reason and the grounding of human beings, and also the things they can expect from popular government. Rightly, I also
he has. Obama has a kind of respect for resolute action, and all of his examples of resolute action fit the typical, liberals' preferences, more or less, of today. So he never felt challenged enough. He never really saw that as so much of a problem. Why these values and not other values? That he never really made the kind of inquiry I think that you would need to make to sort of get to the bottom of that subject. And so he is, though, driven to say things which are quite remarkable, especially in that passage of Audacity of Hope that we're alluding to here, where he says that there's something about the anti-abortion activist and the animal rights activist that he admires. That is precisely their insistence on moral absolutes. Yeah. Now, but if you look at the examples, the juxtaposition of the anti-abortion cause and the animal rights cause really really reveals the terrible problem of relativism in his thought. One man's unborn child, unborn human being, is another man's chihuahua. They're both, and you can be absolute. You can base political action on an absolute belief in each, and he's not struck by the fact that they are really quite different, and that a reasonable person should be able to distinguish between defending an unborn innocent life, whether you agree with it or not. But still, just to distinguish intellectually the case of an unborn human being from the case of a dog or cat who's been offended by certain practices.
Well, you start to understand, I think, the rather striking statement during the campaign of 2008, this idea that I would not appoint a judge if I did not think they would have sympathy for the poor and the downtrodden party in the case. So it wouldn't be a rule of law, fidelity to the text, et cetera. It would be something other that would matter. And I'll read two quotes from that you cite. One, quote, "I am robbed even of the certainty of uncertainty, for sometimes absolute truths may well be absolute," end quote. And then another one, quote, "Lincoln and those buried at Gettysburg remind us that we should pursue our own absolute truths only if we acknowledge that there may be a terrible price to pay." So our own absolute truths. Let me ask you this question. Why, it seems, so we talked at the beginning, progressivism can't make payroll. So there's a basic existential problem it faces. Why do we care at this point? It seems to be collapsing. Social democracy seems to be collapsing in Europe. They're largely playing out the string with endless rounds of conferences and meetings. Our country, it seems at least we already have tangible evidence among the states that they are moving forward, if not being able to liquidate their massive $4 trillion pension debt overhaul that they've got. But there seems to be maneuvering there, and we also seem to have a party, a philosophy out of ideas, out of philosophical energy. Why should we care at this point?
Well, in part because the outcome is not clear. I think that the crisis of liberalism can issue in several different directions, and there's nothing inevitable about which way it's going to go. Liberalism could, at some point, go out of business. That is, it could collapse internally upon itself because the confluence of problems in the economy and politically may simply be too much for it. We see political parties, the Liberal Party in Canada, the old Liberal Party in England. Political parties and movements do sort of go out of being sometimes. They collapse of their own weight. The most massive recent example being communism in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. But I think that scenario is probably too hopeful, and it's more likely that liberalism will go down in a fight. And it could be, it's a fight that liberalism could win in the sense of, persuading let's say the American people at some point that in order to fulfill their promises that have been made in the welfare state, we really do have to expand the share of the economy under the government's control by 10 percentage points of GDP or 20 percentage points of GDP. It's not impossible that we could sort of Swedenize the American economy and that the government could really absorb not just about 35 or 40% of GDP, but 50% or more of American GDP. And we could really have a much more socialist or democratic socialist outcome. In that sense, liberalism would radicalize. That's a possibility. And the moral consequences and the fiscal consequences of that, of course, in long term, I think would be extremely bad. But it is a possibility, and it's not clear to me that the third possibility, namely that in a fight they could be defeated by forces of broadly speaking, conservatism. That's also a possibility, but that depends upon what conservatism does and what conservatives do. And if they don't understand the problems better than liberalism does, there's certainly a possibility for disappointment from the from the conservative point of view. These guys, our guys, if speaking for myself, our guys may blow it, and that's that does happen. It isn't always the case that the people you think who ought to win do win. The identification of those two things is Hegelianism. That's the root of progressivism, and it's one of those things that I'm hoping America can outgrow.
Let me ask you kind of as a final thought question. You have written extensively about the ideas of our founding, and many others have. Why does a political movement seemingly diametrically opposed to these founding ideas find fertile ground in America, become dominant, at least in the mid-century, reshaping so many governing institutions, reshaping civil society in many respects, reshaping the education system. How do we understand their success? And they're putting down roots.
Well, that's a great question, and it's a very difficult and complicated question to answer. In part, it's because liberalism did not always explicitly attack the founding or describe itself as a replacement for the founding. To a great extent, liberals, this would include Woodrow Wilson and FDR and even Barack Obama, in part, make the argument not that they are out to replace the founders' understanding of things, but simply that they're out to update it, to keep the Constitution, so to speak, in tune with the times. And what they're doing, therefore, they say, is simply what the founders themselves would do if they were here today in our new circumstances. That argument splits the difference, as it were, and makes them sound conservative. It makes them sound like they are saving the founding, that they are keeping the Constitution from becoming what it otherwise would be, part of a world that's dead and gone. Instead, they want to keep it alive. I mean, the living Constitution keeps the Constitution alive, they say. That introduces a great deal of confusion into the debate and is very politically effective for them. And one of the purposes of my book is to try to expose that argument and the limitations of that argument. But the other side of the question, I think, is the American founding does not create a political system that is a machine that goes of itself. It creates a democratic or republican political system in which the opinion of the people and the understanding of the people of their own political culture and their political and ethical culture and their institutions is crucial. And over time, the solidity of public opinion, the confidence of public opinion, and the understanding of the public of its own institutions, I think, has deteriorated. This is partly due to education and to professors and teachers who have abandoned to a large degree the genuine grounds of American politics for the liberal substitute. But it's also simply the fact that one of the vulnerabilities of a regime that is Republican is that every generation has to be re-educated in the truths of the Constitution, and if it doesn't happen, then it is quite easy for the system to turn against itself. And I think that's a lot of what has happened.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot. The free society depends upon both institutions and persons that it cannot create, which I think that's large measure what you're saying. There's something actually thick and vertical.
Yes, I mean, as Ronald Reagan used to say, freedom is only one generation away from extinction. Yes. Now, and although the institutions of our government try to prolong the safe period, not just try to stretch out that generation, as it were, by preventing the public from taking rash actions through, by blocking things, the separation of powers and so forth and so on. Still, in the end, that's correct. I mean, in the end, the people have to want to rule themselves and have to have the virtues that enable them to rule themselves. And if they lack the understanding and the virtues that are necessary to do that job, then no system of government can, protect them from themselves.
Professor Kesler, I'm so glad you were with us today. Thank you for sharing your insights and talking about your book, I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very kind of you to invite me. I enjoyed it.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.